Yeah, guys, welcome to the Africa for Almans podcast. And now, after 35 weeks, we have finally reached the heart of this very African German project. It is time for Namibia. So before we get into this vivid conversation that I had together with my close friend and brother, the political analyst Shaandre Finnies on his home country Namibia, maybe 3 quick points. First of all, if you have not been tuning into this format, let me maybe quickly introduce it to you. This is a 1-year project we are running. In each week, one podcast comes out dealing with one African nation at a time. Being it from A till Z, it's a 55-week long format, and we engage in a variety of topics for each nation, being it economic issues, historic issues, geography issues, and also political issues, of course. Of course, there's a lot of English-speaking content, a lot of German-speaking content, but also, more importantly, nearly half of the episodes feature guests who are experts on the corresponding topics. Second of all, I want to say thank you to Shaandre Finnies, my close friend, and especially since over our friendship, you would imagine that maybe the things get softer, the topics, the disagreements, we are more on the same side of issues, but this is not the case, and I think this format and specifically this very podcast here benefits from that, not only since he has introduced me to a variety of very interesting people that have been on the show so far, but also since we have not lost the energy and the fun at debating the controversial topics that both of our nations are sharing, being it the land expropriation issues, being it also, of course, the German genocide against the Herero and Nama, where compensation debates are still ongoing until this very day. And so this format brings all of the perspectives on these things without losing the controversy. Plus, Shaandre is a professional person on the media outlets of variety Namibian platforms. He has also been a public speaking figure, so he does it very professional. I'm very happy for that, and I'm looking forward to future cooperations with him. And then thirdly, of course, this is very important, I think, for all German people listening to. Namibia, Germany have shared some historic relations and, as I mentioned before, also controversy. And I think a lot of these aspects can be taken from it and can be seen positive for a future where the bond between both countries will and should get closer. So make sure to follow Africa for Almans if you like this podcast, if you like this format as a whole. We are on Instagram, we are on Facebook, we are technically on all platforms, being it YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and all other podcast catchers out there. Give us a review, write us an email, or donate also via PayPal or Steady. Everything for that you will find in the show notes of this very podcast. And most importantly, enjoy this long but informative interview. Yeah, welcome again to the Africa for Almans podcast. This week for episode number 35, we have a true favorite of mine, not only personally, but also country-wise. We speak about Namibia. And with me today, I have, tuning in from Ankara, Shaandre Finnies. A very good afternoon to you, Shaandre.
Good afternoon, and I'm actually tuning in from Istanbul. Just a small correction there.
First big step. Okay. I mean, the German speaking about Namibia. I'm going to have a lot of difficult moments coming up again. So start with this one. Istanbul, of course. Yes, indeed, Istanbul.
Yeah.
And you're Namibian, but currently studying in Turkey. And maybe to give the audience somewhat of a small introduction, the two of us have quite some history, not only in terms of friendship, but also in terms of Namibia. I think, we met together with also Edwin and Rebecca, who have been on this podcast in the past already. And the two of us, we were involved in some projects. I think we shouldn't go too much into detail unless we have something big to announce. But we have shared a lot of story in that way. And I learned really much about Namibia myself, which indirectly or directly also led me then to do this format. So first of all, thank you for the past 2.5 years of inspiration. And now maybe to start off, how do you see yourself now as a expat of Namibia within Turkey these days?
I think it's firstly, thank you for having me on this podcast. And then how do I see myself as an expert of Namibia? Turkey. I think it's it's not really that I view myself as an expert of Namibia living in Turkey, but there's always this onus of representation, especially if there's only a few people from Namibia studying here, which is currently the situation. And yeah, I'm a student of political science and international relations at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. And yeah, that's basically that.
But you have all your life basically spent in Namibia, right? And those are now the first years outside of the country.
Yeah, these are my first years outside of the country. It's my first experience outside of Namibia in terms of long-term living. I have, of course, had the privilege before in my late high school life and subsequently after that to travel a bit with various programs that I was involved in. So yeah, but at the moment, this is the first time living outside of Namibia.
It's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, on this program, we've had quite numerous Turkish studying African students. You know probably all of them. If not, I have known them through you. It is a quite big hub you guys have down there, right? Maybe to explain myself a bit, I didn't want to drift directly into Namibia. We'll come to that in a bit. But I think many people, at least from Germany, have already some idea when talking about Namibia, but not so much about Namibians outside of Namibia. Yeah, it's is there like a large diaspora maybe of Namibians out? I mean, relatively,
Well,
not in total numbers. Maybe.
Even relatively, I don't think so. Namibians don't really leave the country that often. We have a quite small diaspora. I would say the biggest diaspora would exist in Europe, with Germany being one of those countries with a lot of Namibians living there, specifically because, you know, of the colonial history, I can say, which is basically, which you see with the former colonies of of France. Their citizens, they would find their diaspora normally in France. So it's a normal phenomena. But yeah, the second would be the US, and then there's also a big diaspora in Asia. Turkey, for that matter, doesn't really host such a big diaspora. I mean, by my last count, we were only about 7 students in Turkey studying. Yeah, I'm not sure about business people and so on. We also don't have official diplomatic representation here. Our embassy in Berlin is accredited to Turkey as well.
From Berlin to Turkey, wow, that's like, oh damn, big.
Yeah, so it's one of the posts that's assigned to that embassy in Berlin. But other than that, I think Asia specifically, like I said, with specifically China being the biggest player there. A lot of students go study in China. Then we have a lot of business people going to China and people who find jobs in China, like teaching English and so on and so forth. And yeah, so I think just to get back to your initial point is that, there's quite a vibrant and sizable African community in Turkey of students, of professionals. There's also quite a large number of diplomatic representation by different African countries in Turkey at the moment. And this provides some sort of a community, even for us as Namibians who are like 7 spread across Turkey. So whichever city we find ourselves in, at least there is a similarity in culture, a home to be found amongst other Africans.
I remember that also. I mean, you guys have some SADC, at least network also. I mean, sharing a lot of similar things in terms of food and like other parts with, for example, Botswana or South Africa. So there is some sort of a belonging to a bigger Southern African group, right?
Of course. I think we're closely knit. We have, free pass between each other's borders without the requirement of visa for a maximum of 3 months, and it's unlimited renewable. So we share common culture in SADC, specifically because of the tribal history and all of that. But yeah, we get along very well, even abroad.
Okay, I think since also a lot of Turkish people are tuning in, and you said already there's only a small amount of people there, maybe this is also then an interesting platform or podcast to get for other people except only the Germans some idea about Namibia. How would you maybe describe Namibia in terms of its location? I mean, it's a quite unique country. We'll come to that, but maybe to an outside person, how would you the most easily describe Namibia in terms of geography?
In terms of, well, Namibia is a country that is located in the southern part of Africa, in southern Africa, to the north of South Africa, to the west of Botswana, and to the south of Angola. And on its own west, it has the Atlantic Ocean. And I think Namibia is geographically known quite famously for, the famous Namib Desert, which is
Namib
one of
Desert.
the oldest deserts in the world. It's also breathtaking in terms of just aesthetics, because it's one of the few deserts in the world that meets directly in its entire length with the ocean,
I would be
with
shocked
the
if another
Atlantic
one.
Ocean.
I think it's the only one by far. I mean, I could be very
I've
shocked.
heard that there are some in Mauritania and Libya as well,
Okay.
but
Yeah, you're
but
right. Actually, Libya. I remember there was some, but I'm not. I
mhm.
can't imagine it's like. I mean, because here you have like the sand mountains just right into the ocean.
Yeah, yeah.
Just
The
Google
sand
it.
dunes
It's
are
crazy. It's crazy.
right,
It's really.
right next to it. Other things that geographically we are quite well known for is we have a second desert which hosts one of the world's oldest tribes. It's called the Kalahari Desert, which we
Kalahari.
share on our border with Botswana.
Hmm.
Um, and we're also known for the Fish River Canyon, which is the second largest canyon in the world. After the Grand Canyon in the United States, Fish River Canyon is the second largest canyon. So adventurers always take to Namibia to go hike the Fish River Canyon, which is also one of the only canyons in the world that has a, a river flowing through it, which is the Fish River. And at the end of this canyon, it's magnificent in the sense that at the mouth of the river and at the end of the canyon, you have hot springs. So
Wow.
this is always known for people who are up for an adventure of hiking and who love hiking. Um, they always know Namibia for that.
That
And
is.
yeah, please go ahead.
I'm just trying to repeat it because I think it's if you imagine the country, it's quite unique that you have on the right side a desert, and on the left side where normally there's like the coastal population, where normally the majority of all other coastal countries have their capital and whatnot, and there's also a desert. So technically, the Namibian, let's say, highlands, or the area where population can farm and live peacefully, is squeezed in a bit. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's relatively correct. But I mean, the size Namibia is a very large country.
Similar to
So the
Turkey, I
size
think, right?
of the deserts,
800,000
yeah,
ish.
it's a little bit larger than Turkey.
Ah, nice.
Um, so in terms of square kilometers, it's 825,419
Wow,
square
that's
kilometers. Um,
impressive.
so yeah, so there is a little bit of that squeeze as you mentioned, but it's not as significant that it takes away too much of the arable land in the country.
It is a quite arable place as such, right? Farming and um, let's say agriculture take up large part of the economy.
Of
Yeah.
course, agriculture is central to the economy.
What would you say are like the most famous products in Namibia, maybe in terms of farming or agriculture?
Well, Namibia is known for we're not known for having a crop farming industry. We're more in livestock.
Hmm.
So Namibian beef is known across Europe, especially, which is
The
our biggest
beef,
market for
indeed.
our beef. We produce some of the world's best beef. We also have a very vibrant aquaculture with premium products such as rock lobster that's also sold across Europe, which is now developed not only in a natural sense in terms of what the ocean provides, but it has been developed into an aquaculture where small scale or aquaculture farmers are actually farming these lobsters and various other types of seafood um,
So wait,
that they can eat for
despite
themselves.
being located on the sea with a huge desert, there's also fishing.
Yeah, yeah. There's also fishing. It's very central towards the economy.
Huh. So they've built like artificial cities in the desert, technically, or how does it work?
Yes, we have three cities that I mean are quite old. Even during the colonial period, was very central to the economy. These are notably Lüderitz, Oranienburg in the south. These are two towns in the south. And then you have in the central coastal areas now, you have Walvisvai and Swakop, two cities very close to each other. And Swakop is more seen as the resort town of Namibia. It's seen as the coastal resort town. So its main industry is a tourism industry. And then Walvis Bay is for the fishing and the ports. In fact, Namibia's largest port and one of the largest, currently the largest port in SADC, and somewhere in the top 5 in Africa, is located in Walvis Bay. Construction that was more than $1 billion that was finished last year, and also very important to our economy because the Namibian Ports Authority contributes immensely towards the GDP and the logistics industry within Namibia, because we are situated strategically next to countries like Botswana, Zambia, that are landlocked countries. So they make use of our ports as well in order to be able to facilitate their trade and imports and exports.
So something like the Mozambique maybe have with the end of the Zambezi River, that also Namibia functions here as somewhat of a hub for countries which have no direct access to the ocean. Interesting.
Indeed, yeah.
So maybe in terms of population, we have covered now some of the cities. Could you maybe also then tell us a bit about the size and also the division into ethnicities of Namibian population?
Yeah, Namibia has a population. I mean, the last time we had official statistics of the population was in 2017, which was 2.534 million inhabitants. I'm sure it's way much larger than that now. And we have around 13 tribes in Namibia. I'm speaking under correction. We have some of the oldest tribes living in Namibia, but in terms of size and even tribes, because of the colonial history, are settled in specific areas. So you'll find a tribe owning a majority of an area, like living as the majority in a certain area. But in terms of national statistics, Namibia's tribes that leads the tribal statistic is the Oshibambo or the Obambo in the northern part of Namibia, which makes up close to between 45 to 53% of the population. We don't do a census on tribes. So in our census questionnaire, we don't ask people to identify their tribes, simply because we don't want to promote tribalism in that sense.
Very nice.
So it's always estimates, but there's definitely a consensus that the Oshibambo is the leading tribe in Namibia in terms of numbers. And then we have tribes like the Damara, the Nama.
The Nama, okay,
Herero,
yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Those are...
the Herero, the Ovahimba, one of the oldest tribes, and they still live what some would call primitively, which is, I believe, is a wrong way of looking at it, but they still live within their traditional setting in the majority. They do not tend to migrate to cities. They are educating their children, but in terms of their customs and their lifestyles, they still live very much the way they did decades and centuries ago. And then another tribe that is quite similar to the Himba in terms of how they attach towards their culture and their heritage and their lifestyles in terms of that is the Khoisan.
Khoisan, yes.
Is found they are located in the eastern side of the country in the Kalahari Desert. And they've survived in the Kalahari Desert for decades. In fact, the Khoisan are known to be the first inhabitants of Southern Africa, because all these other tribes are, 99% of the other tribes are Bantu tribes who moved from West Africa during the Great Bantu Trek. And then, I mean, we have also this nuance between, the Bantu and European and the Khoisan, which is the Bastard and the Khaled. Something that is also found in South Africa and some other Southern African states. And the Bastard basically and the Khaled are basically mixed tribes, which has mixed with between Bantu and European in that sense. And it happened so long ago that this mixture happened that the population grew and grew because they started settling together, and almost a new tribe was established during the period of colonial rule. And with the establishment of this new tribe, they had to basically circumvent and navigate their own cultural identity and create their own cultural identity. The Colours not so much, but the Basters, specifically in Namibia, they're settled just south of the capital city, 80 kilometers south of the capital city. And they have a homeland, a traditional homeland, just like all the other tribes. They speak Afrikaans in their own dialect, of course. And they have unique cultural customs that they identify themselves with in terms of names and all of these things. But it must be stated that unlike most of the other tribes, they aren't as old of a tribe as compared to the Himba or the Khoisan or the Oshibambo or the Damara and the Nama.
And
I think it would delve too much in. I must just say that there are 12 different major ethnic groups. And amongst these 12, they have like different clans as well. And as a result of that, you have 30 unique languages which are spoken throughout the country. So you can find in the Oshibambo, you can have Oshibambo as a tribe, but you have different clans like the Ondongwa and these other different types of clans, and they have their own version or dialect rather of Oshibambo spoken. The same with the Damara and the Nama. Basically, the language is extremely similar, but you find that the skin color of the Namas are normally a bit lighter than that of the Damaras. Damaras are normally identified as being a bit more dark, and the language differs a bit, but in terms of cultural way of living and all of that, they're quite similar in that sense. So it's a very diverse culture. We also do have a European community. We have a large German community for that fact, obviously due to our colonial history, but the German Namibians that truly identify as Namibian, while they have they're ethnically German, but they identify, as Africans and as Namibians also living in Namibia.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Some of them even have never been to Germany. Yeah, I mean, I spoke to some when we were down there together, and it's a very unique situation since this is not the case in any other country in the world. I think outside of Middle Europe. So it's a quite special thing. Now, maybe before, I mean, you opened very smoothly already the chapter of history to us. But before we jump into the door, maybe something lastly about the geography that I find very interesting. I remember also from my discussions with Fanny, I mean, she's also from Namibia, but she always showed me this hand trick, how to simulate the Namibian country by hand. And there was always the thumb, like a very small, thin thing going out of Namibia to the east. Could you maybe explain us a bit what that exactly is and how that came to be? I mean, it's a very weird shape of border going there.
Well, it was formerly called the Caprivi Strip, and it has a lot to do with our German colonial history in that sense. And it's basically situated in the northeastern part, the most northeastern part, and it sticks out of, as you mentioned, the rest of the country. It has recently been renamed in 2013 as the Zambezi region, because we're trying to get rid of the colonial legacy of naming things and make it Africanize it more, make it more relative towards.
So like the river Zambezi.
Land. Yeah, so like the river, because the river Zambezi passes through there. The Zambezi River passes through there. It's also the point where Namibia has a direct border with Botswana, Zambia, and Zimbabwe.
Wow.
At the tip of that, there's a border between all of these. So you have the Chobe, the Zambezi, and the Kwando River running through this. And you also have the Okavango Delta running through the strip. We call it a strip because that's basically how it looks. But the history of this is basically there was a general from Germany called von Caprivi. And
a very un-German name, but go on.
Yeah, so Leo von Caprivi. He was
Okay.
the German chancellor, and he basically negotiated this piece of land with the United Kingdom in 1890
Hmm.
for exchange with Zanzibar. So basically, he said,
Ah,
"Okay,
yeah,
you
yeah,
can have
yeah.
Zanzibar, and then we'll take this strip of land."
Interesting.
And basically, so it didn't originally belong to Namibia. It wasn't originally part of Namibia. But once Von Caprivi did this, he then got it to be annexed to German Southwest Africa. And the reason he did this is because they wanted to access the mighty Zambezi River, which was a route to Africa's east coast, where the German colony Tanganyika was based.
Hmm.
Um, so, in terms of trade during the colonial times, they wanted this, and they signed a annexation agreement in a treaty. The annexation agreement was part of the Hel- Heligoland Zanzibar
Helgoland, because
Treaty.
I was going to
Yes.
say, this is what we remember in Germany to exchange Helgoland with Zanzibar. But I wasn't sure, I wasn't known to the fact that this was also part of that deal. Interesting. So
Yeah,
here we see the
yeah,
full geopolitical perspective. Perfect.
yeah. So that it was part of that deal,
Yeah.
and yeah, it played extremely important. It was important for military strategy as well. Between 1965 and 1994, the ANC, the African National Congress, um, had some of their operations against the South African apartheid government on the strip, of course, with SWAPO plan fighters as well. And through this history, you know that many of the fighting groups went into exile and fought from exile. So because this strip meets right where Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Zambia meet, a lot of the camps were in Zambia and Zimbabwe
Ah,
at that
okay.
time. So a lot of fighting took place on this as well, on the strip as well. But yeah,
Interesting.
so
I
that's
mean,
basically how it came into existence.
very smoothly driving into the history part. Before we get stuck into the independence war, maybe could you, since you do already an excellent job in going calmly and rationally through these subjects, could you maybe give us a brief coverage of the history until that, yeah, let's say a struggle of the SWAPO and ANC on the strip of Caprivi?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Namibia has a, a pre-colonial history. It is known that some of the first humans lived in the Huns Mountains rather, in the
Hmm.
south of Namibia, and it's known because there are rock paintings in there. So it's estimated as early as 25,000 BC that people actually lived there, and many of these types of drawings and things were found there. We know that the San, the Khoisan, the Bushmen, alongside the Damara, are the oldest ethnic group in Namibia. And we are sure that most of these paintings were created by them. So these were the two tribes that lived there. They lived on livestock. The Damara specifically, the San, adapted measures of having livestock, being pastoralist and moving around from one place to another, but they also had a hunting and gathering culture. And then you had the Bantu migration. So in the 17th century, the Herero and the Ovambo and Kavango, uh, migrated from West Africa, and they settled specifically here in modern day Namibia, along with various other Bantu tribes that are now spread across Southern Africa. And also with the Herero was the Himba people, because they are extremely close in terms of cultural relations. One would always almost call them cousins in that sense. So
Hmm.
all of them came down. And then you had the Urlams. The Urlams also spoke a language similar to Afrikaans. They were Khoisan initially, but they adapted Boer customs. Which goes more further. This is in the 19th century, and then you also have the bastard immigration. So basically, I'm just trying to give you an overview of
Yeah,
how the
perfect,
tribes
perfect.
moved
I think
in.
we
But
get a bit more stuck in the colonial and independency chapter. So just to get there,
yeah, yeah.
that's a good idea.
So yeah, so then the first instance of colonialism started with Germany, German Southwest Africa, and I mean, we know when the Germans, I assume everyone would know when the Germans moved in, but there's some key things that, should be mentioned. It's that the the Germans came in the beginning, and basically, after the first governor was appointed to what was now called German Southwest Africa, to be able to, turn it into a full colony. There was relative understanding between the local tribes and the Germans in terms of, this is where we live. We don't know, are you really explorers? Are you, what are you really doing here? And then soon after that, with the German expansion in Namibia, you had wars starting to break out, wars for liberation starting to break out um, in in Namibia, or then German Southwest Africa, as it was called back in the day. But the colony was basically established in 1884,
Mhm.
and it basically covered the entire area of Namibia over that period of time.
And it interestingly was very late. If you compare to other like pieces of land in Africa, I think Namibia was one of the last who was colonized by any foreign power, right? Was there like
Yeah.
a disadvantage to go there, or was it a rebellious local population? What do you think kept other colonial powers from reaching?
Yeah, well, I'm not entirely at liberty to say that something specifically led to other other colonial powers not coming there. But I do think that Africa at the time was already such a large piece of land. There wasn't an abundance
Mm,
of resources
absolutely.
discovered here specifically. Like, gold was discovered on the Golden Coast, and then slavery became an immediate thing, on the Golden Coast as well. So most of the focus was there. And I mean, there were other powers, imperial European powers, that were also trying to get onto the continent, such as the Ottoman Empire, for instance, and
Mm.
various other empires,
Maybe it's also
So
the
it was,
coastline. It makes it hard, I think, for ships and stuff to get a foot on the land, right? If you have to cross 160 kilometers of desert first,
yeah,
it's
desert, exactly.
quite
Yeah,
difficult
so
to
I
get
think
there.
it was, but actually the Portuguese were the first ones to truly come to Namibia, but it was just a discovery.
Hmm.
There was really there was really nothing that was of significance there. But even at the time, it was interesting because in history they say that the colony of Namibia had a population of around 2,600 Germans during that time, and it's a space of 835 or
Yeah,
100
that's insane. This big.
1,100 square kilometers that was settled there. And I mean, they came for specific things initially. You had um, soon after the um, soon after 1882, a merchant from Burman called Adolf Luderitz, which is now also one of the towns in southern Namibia named after him. He basically requested from Chancellor Bismarck for a protection for a station that he wanted to build in that piece of land, and he purchased that land from a native chief and established a city at what is also known as Angra Pequena at that time, named
Mhm.
by the Portuguese, of course, and it was renamed Luderitz. So on around 1884, he placed this space basically under the special protection of Imperial Germany because he was afraid of the encroachment of the British at the point in time. And I mean, they had a little bit of skirmishes and so on going there. But yeah, in 1884, the first Southwest Africa, German Southwest Africa flag was raised there, and it was basically confirmed that this is now a territory of Germany. And they eventually, slowly but surely, explored more, and then found, that this country is vast and big. And of course, the big claim of Germany on this Namibian land happened and was confirmed during the Berlin conference. So once that happened, it was now accepted amongst all the other powers that, this is Germany's piece of land.
Yeah.
Germany basically rules over this land.
Well, I mean, okay, what follows next? I think it's a quite sensitive topic, since also the awareness for the 20 years of German colonial power in Namibia, even compared to the other territories, is quite low until this day. Not only in Germany, but it should be higher in Germany, of course, as a predators, but obviously is on average in total very low. I mean, yeah, to keep things precise, it resulted in the first genocide of the 20th century, very dark hours. Maybe to get to that very scenario, I think what can be said objectively is that the local population, specifically the Herero, were very proud. Yeah, they weren't very fast to obey to the new incomers. Yeah, so it was maybe some different situation than what Europeans, or in this case Germans, were used to from other parts of Africa, where it took them less, or it went easier to sort of take the land or these other things. And here they were facing quite some resistance. Can that be said?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to understand even geographically the context of what happened, because it's not only the Herero, but it's the Herero and the Nama. And if you look at where they settled, it's in totally different places. The Nama was based in the south, and the Herero were cattle herders in the central eastern region, known as Damaraland, basically. So, I think it's a bit oversimplifying it to state that there was simply a lack of obedience in that sense, because it took a special leader of the Herero to basically say, we won't accept this. Previous leaders of these tribes did work with the German.
Well, I mean, they worked with them. They were traded some guns and whatever to sign some paper, and then in the end they got rid of all of the territory. So if you call that working with the Germans, then okay. But was there like eye-to-eye level cooperation? I don't think so, right?
Yeah, I think that there was at some point in terms of which land people can stay on and so on. But like I said, it was basically a new tribal leader, two new tribal leaders specifically, coming to power within the tribes. And they came to power with this idea that our previous leaders did the wrong thing. They sold too much of our land, like you said. They gave too many concessions. And specifically because both of these tribes were concerned with the fact that they were using their lands for grazing.
Yes. For herds,
yes,
right?
for farming, and things became complicated in that sense. And yeah, so basically when these two tribal leaders, both in two geographically extremely dislocated places, which is in Damaraland, which is in the central eastern part, and in the very south you had the Namas, who also decided that immediately they would not continue with this. But of course the Hereros are more significant, because while we don't have official statistics, I think it's important to just recount specifically what led to this genocide, if you're okay with that, in terms of the first attacks and so on. Because initially the first attack did come from the tribes themselves. So in 1904, the Herero people was led by this new leader called Samuel Maherero, and the Nama were led by Captain Hendrik Witbooi. And they basically decided to come together and say, we're going to rebel.
This is interesting, right? Because they used to be not very cooperative with one another. So they have a common enemy now.
Of course,
they joined forces.
Of course, yeah, because they used to clash a lot, because sometimes they would meet at a central place where they would fight for grazing land in that sense. But basically, in 1904, what happened is they found a camp of around 100 German men in an area of what's modern day Okahania. And they basically killed all of these German men. They fought with them and they killed all of these German men there. It was a surprise attack, but what they did do is they did not kill any children or women. This was even accepted by the Germans later. And shortly after that, General Lothar von Trotta.
Yeah, this is maybe to squeeze in here also, since you mentioned also the change of leadership on the Herero side in the years before that. This is also, of course, a unique scenario now that you have a change of leadership from Governor Leutwein in Germany. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English, Leutwein maybe, to Lothar von Trotta, who then basically was that radical and drastic, some might even say sadistic person, who escalated things. Yeah, so it wasn't like this. Things didn't just naturally go this way. I think if the leadership on these sides didn't go to certain ways, it could have been avoided at many situations.
No, definitely. Yeah, so basically, there was a big battle between von Trotta and the armies of Samir Herero, and the Hereros basically lost this battle. It's known as the Battle of Waterberg, which is a mountainous area in the eastern side as well. And what then happened is that the Germans drove hundreds, some say hundreds of thousands of Herero into what is known today as the Omaheke, which is the eastern region, which is basically a desert. It forms part of the Kalahari Desert, and most of these people died of dehydration. The number wasn't as big a number there, but later on, after this happened, they also decided to launch another attack against the Germans, and they just suffered a similar fate. So it's estimated between 24,000 to 150,000 from these tribes, more significantly from the Herero, were killed through this. And this was women and children. It was indiscriminate. They were driven into the desert. The animals would die. They wouldn't be able to find water. They would die as well. And yeah, we have a disastrous first genocide of the 20th century. Still a very, very emotional topic for majority of Namibians.
Absolutely. But I mean, I think that as one event, also there's other scenarios which or other situations from at least what I now have experienced. For example, also in Lidoritz, it's places like the Haifish Island. It's also the case that similar things to concentration camps that later on were used in different genocides were already in place there. People were already, hungered to death or left by abundance to die on a stony, rocky islands. So just the whole tone. I'm not trying to estimate the effect of the Waterberg scenario, but also overall there was just a very, genocidal vibe around the handling by the German authorities at that time. And
of course,
it is quite difficult now, I think, in the aftermath, because these events have been pretty much more than 100 years, 110 years past, and at least in terms of the historical knowledge, you can always criticize and we can now go smoothly drift into the debate of compensation, which can be very expanded, I'm sure, but this has never been an issue in the past, right? It has always been mentioned sidewise, but once you are in Namibia or once you speak to people, I mean, not only you, but others, you actually realize how big that is of a common historic knowledge. And then you are very much scared to which extent this is actually left out of any awareness on the predator side. Yeah, it is.
I do think that there's been failure in terms of. I mean, we know Germany's rich history, and also its really morally questionable history in terms of what Germany has done in the past. Not that there aren't other nations that have done similar things. I mean, most of the Western powers were established on some form of genocide in terms of how they initiated themselves to become nation states. But I think that Germany has, with what's happened in Poland, what's happened under the Nazis, and under so many other instances, has taken responsibility, apologized, and many
Well,
99% of these instances, created some form of awareness, apologized, and gave some form of reparation. But I think what's even more painful is it's not necessarily the fact that there hasn't been reparations for this, because that's probably the last step towards this. Is the step of acknowledgement and awareness, not just by the German government or those who work within the international relations core of Germany, but in terms of the society and the people understanding that this is a part of their history. It's a painful part of both of our histories. I'm sure that every German would agree that it's a painful part, and it's something that should have never happened and should never be repeated anywhere else. But I think that acknowledgement, even for the victims, it does something significantly. And then, yeah, even Germans in Namibia, to that extent, are sometimes very ignorant about it and brush it off just as easy as a German living in Germany would.
I mean, the thing gets more complicated, I think, since this specifically targets only two tribes of the modern day Namibia, right? Serero and Nama. And both of them, I mean, you might correct me, but at least from what I remember, the Nama are in the present day a bit marginalized, right?
Yeah, of course. Both of them are kind of marginalized. Yeah.
It would be maybe easier if maybe a group of 12 tribes would have faced the German army back then, and the state of Namibia already existed, and we could just say now, okay, these guys obviously were from all tribes. We can equally compensate everybody, but this is maybe also where this whole compensation debate gets a bit stuck, because the identification of where and what to compensate, and I mean, it's still an ongoing law case, I think, right? Until this day, it is in the UN court, and it is still. I'm not sure what the current state is, but it's still not clear who actually is then to get the money. Is it some tribal leaders, if the case is one, of course, or is it going to be the Namibian government as such, right?
Yeah, look, I think that's a debate that should be held internally between those different parties in Namibia. I think it's important also that we look at how presidents has been said, how our presidents has been said when reparations for genocide in the past has been given. Who has it been given to, and how was it administered? This idea that it's two tribes in the country, which I don't form a part of any of them, but I do understand the need for those reparations. Because it's two tribes, it becomes difficult. I find it a bit weird, because you have in various other parts of the world, you have similar situations where a group of people, that's the point of a genocide, that a specific group of people were targeted for a specific reason, which is what happened to these tribes. They decided to stand up and they were targeted. And in that sense, I think that's a debate that must happen internally, whether the government will work with these tribal leaders. The problem at the moment is Germany is not even talking about reparations. It's not about who is it going to or what. Even if we solve that question tomorrow, the first part is an agreement that, okay, we should pay reparations because we admit that a genocide did happen. And that's what, I'm not speaking from a government perspective, but that's what these tribal leaders and these tribes are demanding at this point in time, that an acknowledgement, an apology, which also an apology, a formal apology also hasn't come through yet. And then obviously legitimate plans for reparations. And then we can have those conversations over who's the money going to go to. And that conversation ultimately must be led by the two tribes and the government, by the leaders of the two tribes and the government. And I'm sure they can find a model along with the Germans in terms of how that money will then be used, who will benefit from it, how will you be able to trace back, and so on and so forth. And other Namibian tribes don't have a problem with this. No other Namibian tribe or tribal leader has come out and said, you know what, we should all benefit from it, because we know that this injustice happened towards a certain group of people. And, you know, if those citizens of the country, you know, are empowered in one way or another through these reparations, it has a domino effect on the rest of us. It has a domino effect on the economy, on the burden that the state has to bear. And as a result, everyone else in the country becomes well off as well. So I think just basically the pain that's there, the government is not as radical about it as people would like to see. Obviously, because we understand we have a special relationship with Germany. It's since our independence been one of the countries that has given us immense support. It's undeniable in terms of German programs in Namibia. That's agreeable, but the pain of the people which is an understandable pain of any tribe who's gone through a genocide, is that they are demanding an apology and they are demanding acceptance that, yes, we will pay reparation. And then maybe we can look at the conditions.
Maybe
so
just
Germany can then say, based on an agreement of where the money should go, or based on A, B, C, and D. But we haven't reached that step yet.
Absolutely.
And so
maybe just to fill the picture with a somewhat German perspective for the Almans part of the audience. I think one aspect is very, very correct of what you mentioned, that the unclearance in this situation is part of why many people in Germany don't feel like this is an easy argument to compensate, because there's no real channel yet. I mean, this could be solved, I think, from the Namibian part. This is actually something realistically solvable, but the other part of critique then mostly comes from the fear of future compensation, because, I mean, as you know, as the majority loser of the Second World War, technically Germany, and of course, in terms of the genocide of Jews and others, rightfully was more or less, or has now more or less a threat of compensation by technically all European countries. And this is every now and then still a debate again. When Greece, the European Central Bank crisis, or let's say the Greece crisis with the European Central Bank was in place, there's always these situations when these things pop up again and they just need a reference point. So many people fear now, once we do this for Namibia, which is sad, because in Namibia's case, I think actually it has a very big point, and it is actually a genocide that is marginalized compared to everything that happened in the Nazi times. But this is also something then, and thirdly, of course, people will argue, as you have also said, that Germany is already to such an extent involved in Namibia, trying to help everything, just that it's kind of useless if you don't flag it right. If you always say, I'm just going to help you, but deep there you're always saying, because I killed you back then, it's a different kind of help, it's a bit cheap of an excuse. But maybe just to cover those critical points from the German side.
I mean, those are arguments we hear all the time. But I mean, it's also contextual. I think that it is a legitimate concern that Germany has, that, you might have to sell the entire country to pay everyone reparations at the end of the day if you open up this gate. It is a legitimate thing for the Germans, but you can't go to victims with this. You can't tell a victim that, well, I've disenfranchised you, I've done A, B, C, and D to you, and I can't serve the cause of justice in this case because it might open everything else. And I think it's even more, it says more about those other European countries, that they would want to use this as a flagship for that, because I think it's inherently racist also in that sense, because the same conversation wasn't had around when Germany compensated the Jewish community that suffered a genocide as well. These other European countries instead sympathized with the Jewish community, and rightfully so, they should have. But I think that the same courtesy should be given to the people who experienced the first genocide of the 20th century. And they shouldn't be used as a scapegoat to try and milk Germany for every other injustice it has served in that sense. And that's basically the counter to that. But I completely understand that concern from the government. And
I mean, that's what we went for the UN court for. So I think it's very,
there's nothing in the UN court at the moment. I think I must just correct that. There was a court case in New York that was taken by the tribe itself. The two governments are negotiating at the moment.
Okay.
But the
So
Euro
they're
tribe
trying.
itself decided to hire a lawyer in the US, and it took the German government to court for the court to declare that they should give reparations. The court case was thrown out on the basis that the US doesn't have jurisdiction, jurisdictional immunity of the state, that basically another country's court cannot, issue certain verdicts on a state
Okay,
because of
interesting.
the lack of jurisdiction specifically there.
So just a
So that
formal
court case
mistake.
was, so it was thrown out on those technicalities. But there are other plans to launch more court cases, which, in my personal opinion, just as an analyst and as a Namibian, of course, is not really going to be that effective. I think that the differences between the government and the tribal leadership should be sorted out as soon as possible. There should be a united front, and the
That's what I'm
government
saying. As long as
should
there's
give
no.
more recognition in the negotiations to the tribes and to their demands by giving them specifically on the committees and these country instruments that serve to negotiate with the German government, by
Yes.
giving them more space and then equity on those spaces so that they feel part of the process. And I think that the German government should also do more to reach out directly to the tribes, to start dialogues with the tribes instead of just speaking directly to the government. This alienation of the tribes is just going to make the thing more painful and stretched out for more longer. We can solve this in a matter of days if everyone just, is respectful towards the other, and we try and appease each other by giving and taking. Of course, we as Namibians are fully aware that it's not going to be a simple thing of here's your reparations and it's done. And then the German government should also be fully aware that we can't just accept if nothing happens. And specifically, the German people should be aware of this, that, we need to come to a solution, and a solution can only come through dialogue, Namibian concerns taken into consideration, and German concerns taken into consideration, and meet each other at the middle point, and let's move on so that we can heal. I think this is it's a stumbling block in
and it got stuck at some point. Yeah, it's circulating around the same discussion.
Exactly.
It's not going
And
anywhere.
it's a stumbling block in our relations too, as two countries. Even though it's our former colonizer, I think we can build an amazing relationship, better than the one we currently have, a reciprocal relationship for that matter, between Germany and Namibia. And then, I mean, beyond trade and all of these things, but even in terms of cultural aspects, I think we can build an amazing alliance and amazing relationship between the two countries. But we need to get rid of the stumbling block.
Absolutely.
And then get it out of the way for that.
Maybe just to finish it with my analytical perspective on the German public, because I think they're very adaptive, especially in the current, let's say, more empathic awareness generations. That if there would be a clear plan of action, if at some point somehow the Namibian government and the tribal leaders would come up with a coherent form of investment fund, like, I don't know, over a certain amount of years with cultural programs included and some transparency parts where you can pretty much say to any outside viewer, look, at this is the compensation issue, just the question is how much, then you could raise attention and also like get some political capital for that. But I think just now that there's nothing to grasp, and most people don't even know about the background and context, which maybe this format now has provided to some extent. It is very, very unrealistic to see any public attention on this compensation, or like even awareness or understanding. But let's see. I mean, both of us are going to advocate in personal conversations, and also if there is some other platforms. But let's hope this can be solved for the good of both nations. Yeah.
No, definitely.
Okay, I was going to expect that we get into somewhat of a longer episode on that, but maybe now to get closer to the very young Namibian history. German colonial times ended 1914, pretty much with beginning of World War I. So I assume that by 1915 the Brits took over, right?
Yes.
Is it the Brits by themselves, or was it back then already, like, I don't know, apartheid South Africa? Or
no, what happened basically is, the Brits were the administration in South Africa at the time, and what happened in 1915 during World War I, South Africa was, a member of the British Commonwealth, and it had already gained sort of its independence, but it was a former British colony. And yeah, so they then decided, South Africa at that point in time, decided to occupy Namibia. Um, so yeah, the South African forces decided to occupy Namibia, and basically the Germans left.
So
And
you
then what
occupied
happened
by
then?
occupied South Africa, more or less.
Yeah, you can't call it occupied. It wasn't really any more occupied. It was now declared a former British colony.
Okay.
And it was just named as a member of the British Commonwealth. So it was no longer a direct colony in terms of that, but it was basically part of the British Commonwealth, which I feel is a little bit different compared to classifying German colonies and the Commonwealth. In that sense. But yeah, so, there were a few skirmishes. The Ovambo people resisted drastically against this incursion. The Germans tried in the beginning also, but obviously they were weakened after a while because of World War One. And 5 years later, in 1920, South Africa undertook full administration of Southwest Africa, basically by getting a mandate from the League of Nations. And this mandate was called the Class C mandate. It was supposed to be used for least developed territories. Basically gave South Africa full power of administration and legislation over the territory, but it required that South Africa had to promote the material and moral well-being, as well as social progress of the people.
Did that happen?
Sorry?
Did that happen, or was it just the plan?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It became another economic hub for South Africa. There were, various mines. They started working. They started developing a contract labor system, and they started basically setting up a police state, just like they did with the black populace in their own country. Throughout these years, they continued under that mandate. But in 1946 was the birth of the United Nations, basically, had come into existence. And the UN basically asked South Africa to let go of Namibia. And it was then supposed to be put under trusteeship territory so that, there could be more international monitoring over this. But South Africa basically officially said, okay, we agreed to this, but it continued administering Namibia or Southwest Africa at the time as a de facto fifth province of the country. And this was now the ushering of apartheid.
Apartheid, the laws after 1948.
Yeah.
So by status, this applied to both to Namibia as part of South Africa. Apartheid laws applied as well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. It was treated as part of South Africa, completely as a fifth province of South Africa. In terms of governance structures and every rule that applied. There was even freedom of movement between the two countries, and the country was divided up into tribal homelands.
Yeah.
So it moved on. Of course, there was immersive rejection by and fighting back by different groups. We have groups like SWANO, which is actually the oldest political party in Namibia. It's called the Southwest Africa National Union, and it was founded in 1959. Most of its members came from the Herero people. And soon after that, you had the establishment of SWAPO, which also has a very long history of its own, which I don't think is necessary to go into now. So basically, SWAPO was also founded during those times. And there was then, different forms of resistance was started, civil disobedience. This was while at the same time the same was happening in South Africa under the ANC.
Yeah, that was
And
my next question. So
yeah,
South Africa experienced quite some uprising, black movements, these kind of things. Was that the same with Southwest Africa, so in this case Namibia?
exactly. It was the same. I mean, obviously, South Africa as a country itself obviously had always more the advantage of numbers. That's why their
Mm.
skirmishes were always bigger because it was a bigger population. It you know it was just a bigger population, and Namibia was more of a smaller population, and people were basically lived, in a very dispersed fashion. We didn't live with a large group of amount of people in certain areas. So obviously, this had an impact on that as well. But obviously, SWAPO had gained traction also. SWAPO did start the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, which was an armed wing of SWAPO at the time. And what then ensued was, a resistance, an armed resistance against the South African government of the time. So you had basically the struggle for independence that was planned, or the People's Liberation Army of Namibia was in the lead of this, and basically they just started with guerrilla attacks on South African forces, but they were also an army in exile because they would operate from Zambia. Basically, they would set up bases in Zambia, and then they would infiltrate the country through the Caprivi Strip, obviously.
Okay. So now we reached back to the Caprivi uprisings.
Yes.
Interestingly.
Yes.
And this main movement of independence against the South African apartheid state was the SWAPO.
Yes.
Interesting.
SWAPO basically, what happened is SWAPO basically, in brief, at a certain point in time, was given status of the only recognized representative of the Namibian people, right? So this was given to SWAPO by other African countries, by countries. It was also during the time of the Cold War when our war intensified. By those of the Eastern Bloc or the post-Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union bloc, and the UN even gave SWAPO this recognition that it was a legitimate representative of the oppressed people of Namibia.
Okay, I mean,
and that's how SWAPO gained its popularity, and of course it had funding coming in, and it started this war against the South African government at the time.
so we speak now basically about the Cold War areas, yeah, 70s, 80s, these kind of times. Then I assume, I mean, by the logic of South Africa being part of the, let's say, Western Bloc, that the SWAPO was mostly supported, I assume, by, let's say, the Soviet and its allies, right?
Of course.
Okay.
So extremely supported. I mean, there was SWAPO didn't have the numbers. They knew that, and a lot of SWAPO's mobilization. Of course, there was disobedience happening in the country. Of course, a lot of things happened within the country, but a lot of SWAPO's action was through trying to gain international pressure and diplomatic pressure for that sense. So it tried various instances at the UN. It tried to rally up more countries for boycott, sanctions, and these type of things, and for support for their fighters. In Namibia. So yeah.
Part of the Soviet vibes. Did they survive the let's say Soviet relations? Now going maybe closer to the end of the Soviet bloc. So would you say that similar to the end of the Soviet times, also the Soviet elements of SWAPO or somewhat they also decreased?
Well, I think it's important to understand that it was the Soviet relationship that ultimately led to the freedom of Namibia. There was a big massacre in Kasinga in 1979. So what happened was In Kasinga, there was this massacre by the South African government, which it basically just bombarded this entire place. Kasinga is still very, very important to us because it's one of the biggest massacres that we faced during the war with South Africa, alongside that of Katatura. Katatura is a large township, just for context, in Windhoek, and it basically means the place we do not belong. Because what the apartheid government also did is they tried to like separate people by taking them out of their homes and claiming those places to be white spaces for white people only, and moving them into other areas.
Classical
Which would not
South
suit
African
them. Yeah.
policies, yeah.
Yeah, this was part of that. So we basically have a place called Karatura, which translates into the place we do not belong. And I think the most significant relationship between this was the Cubans, between this Soviet bloc. Yes, the Cubans played an extremely important role in Namibia's independence. We normally say, you know, we are a child of international solidarity, midwifed by the UN. But in actual fact, it was on the 4th of May 1978, South African planes flew over Kasinga, which was a refugee camp in southern Angola, filled with Namibians. And the South Africans knew that this camp was administered by SWAPO and that some of the guerrilla fighters were in the camp. And they just threw multiple bombs on the refugee camp, and after that, they landed paratroopers on this camp. And of course, this was massively, condemned internationally. But the Cubans were the ones who, reacted extremely strongly towards this, because the Cubans also had a footing in Angola at the point in time. And the Cubans then came basically to the rescue of the Namibians there. And I mean, moreover than that, the Cubans were also in Angola specifically to assist one of the local resistance movements who was operating in Cuba.
You refer to MPLA?
So, yes, I'm referring to the MPLA. And they basically had a civil war against UNITA. And the Cubans decided to support MPLA, and UNITA was supported by the South African government. So the Cubans entered Angola after they saw that the support was being given to, UNITA, and the MPLA was obviously very left-leaning in their ideology, similarly with SWAPO. And so they say that this was the biggest mistake the South African government made at the point in time, that they decided to go and support UNITA, because it ultimately led to the fall of apartheid between both countries.
Because then the Cubans would be motivated also to help Namibians, SWAPO.
Yes. So when this happened, they entered there. Obviously, there were Namibians in the country, like I just explained with what happened at Ongolombashi and Kasinga specifically. You had the Cubans on one side supporting, obviously, the MPLA. You had South Africa on the other side supporting UNITA. And so it was literally, initially the Cubans had only sent technical advisors, but at some point they had decided to send in actual troops. And when these troops came into Angola, it led to effective guerrilla warfare resistance against the South Africans. up until the point where the South Africans had to basically retreat, and they started retreating and retreating more. And at the end of the day, they finally decided to withdraw.
Not only from UNITA, but also from Namibia.
Not completely from Namibia, but it was part of the agreements. But in December 1975, the South Africans were already starting to withdraw towards the end, and this was after there was a emergency session by the OAU, the Organization of African Union, to make sure that they ensure that there's adequate withdrawal from these parts in northern Namibia and southern Angola. So, it was mostly the Cubans who were able to assist in this. And of course, the agreements that then came out of the end of this war was that a path for freedom for Namibia should be,
Yeah. And through this whole time, the UN was backing SWAPO, or at least recognizing it.
Yeah, it was recognizing it. It was recognizing it. So
it's interesting, because normally you would think the UN, founded by the Western winners of the World War, would be more or less biased against the Soviets, right?
Interesting. Of course. I mean, to a certain extent, but there was a legitimate case for freedom of Namibia. There was a legitimate case, and there was growing pressure from other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, we shall not forget, until this point, everybody in Africa basically had their own country, right? Maybe exception of South Sudan, but pretty much everybody was already independent. Just Namibia was. Until did that last? When did South Africa finally let go?
Yeah, so I think that the key battle was that they call it the Battle of Kutu-Kunavale, which happened between 1987 and 1988. And basically, Kutu-Kunavale is a town that is based in the southern part of Angola, very close to the Namibian border. And this was where there was a really intense battle between the two factions. And it was then at the end of this battle, specifically, that it was then decided that the South Africans have to withdraw completely, because you had on one side you had the Cubans and the Angolans from the MPLA, and then you had on the other side the South Africans with UNITA. And of course, South African National Congress and the Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO fighters, were also fighting on the side of the Angolans and the Cubans. And so at the end of this, the South Africans lost. They basically had to move back, and that led them to the concessions that led to the freedom of Namibia.
So finally, 1990, the last African independency, until, I guess, South Sudan, took place. And was it directly a democratic one, or how would you say did things develop in youngly founded, then called Namibia, right? Because Namibia was probably not the name before.
Yeah, it was later on accepted that we will name the country Namibia. I think before independence in 1990, we had some other skirmishes. We have a party called the Democratic Turnahala Alliance at the time, which formed a government, but was still, this was during the dying years of apartheid in Namibia, or at least South African control in Namibia. They tried to, have some form of elections, but SWAPO was excluded from these elections. And they basically formed the government, but it ended up not being recognized. The elections was extremely flawed, and the UN then had to go back to a negotiation process. And finally, 21 March 1990, we declared independence. We had elected a first democratic president. I think there was always democracy in South Africa and in Namibia. It was just apartheid democracy. So it was only white people could vote, but the popular vote was always respected. And yeah, so it was the first elections that allowed for everyone to participate. And yeah, that I would say it was pretty democratic. And we have 1990 born a Namibia.
Interesting. Yeah, congratulations first on that, of course. And yeah, so the SWAPO then, interestingly, as I guess also in other countries of Africa, we've seen, became technically the leading democratic force and has been that ever since, correct?
To a large extent, yeah. SWAPO, I mean, was fairly democratic in its rule. Since then, we had the founding president, Sam Yoma, who was given 3 terms, obviously because of his special status. The constitution was amended to give him an extra term. But since then, even in the SWAPO party itself, there's vibrant democracy within the party. Namibia has never really had tyrannic, strongman type of leadership. So that the organization of the party was very much based on communistic, socialist party organization, which would allow for, of course, a president and someone, a single center of power, but it also allowed for some form of transparency and accountability within the party. And I think that democracy within the party, and because the party was so popular, remember it already won this. Initially, it was the only party that was given status at the UN. So, and it was running camps. When people were in exile, SWAPO was taking care of them in exile. Even in the country, SWAPO was taking care of them with resource mobilization they got from outside. So it was extremely popular. It was an extremely popular party. It won 2/3 majority in the first election. The founding president won with an extreme majority in the first election. And yeah, so with the vibrancy of the party itself internally spilled over into the country, because majority of the people were party members, majority of the populace were party members, and the expectation was that if the party is democratic, we need to ensure that the country is democratic as well. And I think it's the beauty of, I mean, maybe we can't say that for countries like Eritrea and South Sudan, who are quite late comers on the continent in terms of independence, but I think we had case studies to look at. We had other African countries that had already gone through this process, and we've seen what happens when they made certain decisions in terms of how they organize the state and how they organize participatory democracy processes, and in terms of dictatorships and so on and so on. Of course, context is always different, but I think this helped a lot in terms of ensuring that people then go into the right direction.
And it's similar, at least similar, no, the opposite. Unlike in South Africa, also the debate, let's say, of democracy and peace with the former predators, in this case, maybe the apartheid leaders, at least to me, seems a bit more relaxed, right? Things don't seem to be so escalative as now we see with a lot of crimes, blacks on whites, whites on blacks, like we do in South Africa, right? The things overall seem to be a bit more peaceful in Namibia.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's 2 completely different countries with similar challenges, similar history, but also very different challenges. I think it's
well, I mean, different, but at least from an economic perspective, I when I was checking, for example, the Gini coefficients for numerous other African countries in the whole world, the numbers are number 1, and I think number 2 and 3 are all South Africa, Botswana, Namibia. So this apartheid did leave a significant inequality stamp on these countries, and so you would expect at least some, let's say, tumultic kind of vibes in the present day, which have been so far, at least from my perspective, only been seen in South Africa, right? So surprisingly peaceful, I think, right, with the Namibian case.
Yeah, I think so. I think Namibians compared to South Africans in that sense is a little bit more peaceful. We try and find solutions through other platforms, but I can't say that it will go on like that forever. I think people are losing their patience more and more, and
Is it also maybe that the generation who was in the, let's say, who was already satisfied with independence? I mean, a lot of people like the
yes,
current president, for them, independence was
yes,
the life goal. But people like you, I
of
mean, you've
course,
been born in the 90s. For you, this was basic facts. Now let's see what else is coming, like the next
exactly.
steps have to be done. So is that maybe part,
No,
like over
definitely.
time, the hunger is increasing for, let's say, real equality and real participation?
No, definitely. I definitely agree with that. 100%. Just like you said it there.
Then now we maybe see, I mean, if this cannot be delivered by SWAPO, is there any other forms? I mean, we're drifting, as you can tell already, slowly in the political part of the podcast. But what I found very interesting was, for example, in South Africa now, they're coming up like the more leftish even movements like freedom fighters, even
Yes,
more extreme than ANC, yeah, like the commonly ruling party,
yes,
who seems to be fed up with being in charge for so long. Is there something similar also in
yes.
Namibia?
Well, I think with the last elections, yes, you did have that. SWAPO for years had a absolute, almost absolute majority,
Wow,
more than 2/3 majority. It was able to, with the click of a finger, change the constitution.
damn.
However, what has happened then with the last elections is the dynamics changed extremely. You don't have the same dynamics within the country anymore. You have now these left-leaning, even ethnic parties popping up. And yeah, so even the Namibian economic freedom fighters, for the first time, it's the second time to contest elections, but they won 2 seats in the last elections in parliament. So those left leaning are picking up, and then this is because of what you mentioned, because of the Gini coefficient. If you cannot, if liberal policies and a liberal economy and all of these things were not able to solve people's problems for the past 30 years, Namibia is turning 30 next year, they do get tired of the ruling party. They do get tired of this establishment. And as a result, you have these parties gaining more voice. In the past, you had very centralist parties. I mean, SWAPO also has more of democratic socialism, like safety net policies. We have
Yes.
pension funds. We now have free education in the country. We take care of orphans. We take care of vulnerable children. We have food packages services like the Cubans have for the most vulnerable of society to be able to support them, and all of these different types of grant systems. But at the end of the day, people feel like this is still not enough. People feel like the economy is not growing fast enough. Like wealth isn't being distributed fairly enough within the country. And of course, you have a massive, which is something I believe we'll dwell into soon. You have a lot of corruption also happening within the country.
Yeah, big point. I mean, the current president at least is under pressure. I would say it in the best way. And yeah, I'm, for me at least, very curious to see, because there were, at least from my understanding, there were mechanisms who could have led to better, let's say, share of equality. I mean, nobody wants expropriation, but you could have had some bigger funds over the last 20, 30
Yes,
years being
yes,
transferred from one side to another.
yes,
Something that could have been
yes.
done with compensation even. But I guess political capital was not there, and people like leaders in the ANC and SWAPO both were too fed up to feed their own families. And now let's see what the alternatives are, because I think the people still have that need, right?
Of course. People still have the need of land. Land is,
Why is land such an issue? Because I think Namibia is such a huge country, and I remember when I was there, always also we want the land. The land is the debate of land. It's always such a clicking buzzword, let's say. Yeah, so it is quite always about the land, right?
yeah, of course, because you have a population of 10% of the population that owns 90% of not only the economy but also the land. And land land is something that is of significant value to where you're from. I mean, I couldn't imagine how Germans would react if inherently, I mean, probably now you have a lot of foreign ownership of land in Germany because Germans decided to sell their land to foreigners. But that didn't happen in Namibia. You had a genocide take place, you had years of apartheid take place, and through this, the land was gained. The same within South Africa. It was taken through violent means. And people never had the, you know, society progressed, and history has shown that society progressed through this process. People worked their land, they moved to villages, they moved to cities, and they gave up slowly, you know, through this process to move to cities, get an education. And then our generation, especially in developed countries, have no interest in land at this point.
Yeah.
But we were not allowed that process. We were not allowed to have that process to work our own land to feed ourselves, to be able to use our land as a form of capital, you know, to establish businesses or to be able to give ourselves economic expediency in both these countries. And that's why it's so contentious. African societies, fortunately or unfortunately, however you may want to look at it, are not as city orientated, developed as
They're not,
Europe,
yeah.
for
It's
instance.
more rural. I
Yeah,
guess also, yeah.
but it has led to forced urbanization. I don't think there's forced urbanization within other parts of the world. Even if you
Absolutely.
look at Asia,
You know, it's one of the big
even if you
global
look at
trends,
Asia,
urbanization. The
yeah,
biggest mega trends.
of
Nobody talks about that. Everybody talks about climate change. Urbanization is something, if not equally impactful.
But I think urbanization in other parts of the world happened as a natural process. People worked their farms, they had capital, you know, fathers and mothers would send their kids to school by taking out loans or mortgages against their land. You
Yeah.
understand what I mean? And we don't have that privilege because we were not allowed that. Our land was taken from our ancestors at such an early time that we could never progress as naturally as everyone else. So it's not that foreign ownership is an issue. It's
So
that
the vehicle of land was taken.
because land was not available to the natives for such a long time, they couldn't follow the same economic process that other societies that owned their land initially for long periods of time. And we feel at this moment in time, agriculture and even just land for living is an essential part of the struggle towards economic freedom and towards balancing the forces. Because you would see, for instance, that on someone's farm, they would discover gold or uranium. The person gets enormous, or the communities even. We have a communal land system as well, because we are tribal societies. Even those communities and those tribes would get massive compensation for this. But in Namibia, you don't have these tribes or these people owning the land. So you find the people who own the land who are inherently not from there and who aren't in the majority getting this type of compensation. And unfortunately, this just widens the economic gap, the G coefficient that you spoke of earlier.
Yeah, it's insane if you think about it. Yeah, I mean, everybody would have thought of some oil-rich country maybe to be in number one, like Dubai, or I don't know. But it is, in fact, Namibia and those countries. And I mean, that's an interesting point also, the tribal aspect. I think the concept of property ownership is not to such an extent natural there. Yeah, so it makes it even easier, I think, to expropriate that by I'm not sure, you can maybe explain it better, but I remember from conversations with Fanny also that there's certain forms of lease where people can lease the land only from some either the government or somebody else, and then these leases will fall away. For example, if your wife is in charge, if you pass away as a man, your wife can't take over that lease because it's male contract only.
Yeah,
she loses
that's
basically
a
all of the
communal
years
land
she has.
system in the tribal societies. Yeah, but more so than that, Frederic, what I think is even more concerning is the fact that you have such a large country, and then you have an individual family who, you know, by the nature of the past laws, is a white family that owns 17,000 hectares of land, but they can only afford to farm about 2,000 hectares of that land. So the other 15,000 hectares lays barren. It's not being used. And then you have people that are massively unemployed from a particular color group And one of the solutions towards this would be through agriculture, even if it's not commercial agriculture, but subsistence agriculture. And you can't do that. So you find this economic deficit then within that particular group.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example, I think, because part of the, let's say, Western economic education, of which, of course, I'm now part of as well, is that inequality to some extent is key to a capitalistic market functioning society. But if it gets to such an extreme, there's nobody who's going to understand it anymore. There's no social understanding. People,
because
they
you
don't
don't
get
even
together.
have a market now. Capitalism also has to thrive over market.
Yeah, things go up and down, you know.
I mean, in the liberal view, at least, is the most functional part of capitalism is a large middle class. Not necessarily that you have the whole country as billionaires, which doesn't really work under capitalism. But it's largely the idea that if you have a large middle class, with this large middle class, then you can create a market for capitalism to thrive. And of course, some people will be super rich. But if you have a middle class that can form as a market, that can buy the products of capitalism, then capitalism works. But even in a country like Namibia, you don't see foreign direct investment or any form of investment sprawling or being as vibrant because there's just no market. No investor wants to go to a place and go open up a business if they can't guarantee sales for that aspect. So it's actually detrimental to capitalism. The current system is detrimental to capitalism in itself. It's contradictory to its theories because it doesn't allow for it to thrive.
And I guess also this is then what led to abusing the few sectors that actually are highly lucrative, right? I mean, you said already in the past, mining is a big thing. Also fishing, correct?
Yes.
And I mean, thanks to you, I was also very fastly involved in that current debate ongoing. Could you maybe give us an insight into the Namib leagues, as I like to call it, the Namibian fishing leagues, which maybe now fill in the topic we just covered, where also the few sectors which are thriving are then abused by the elites who already fall on the wrong side of the Gini coefficient.
Yeah. So towards the end of last year, we had a big scandal that came out. It was called, actually the official name for it is fish rot. That's the hashtag on Twitter in case people want to follow, which basically one of the biggest industries, like you said, is the fishing industry in Namibia. And it basically exposed corruption within government with two key central government figures in the current, were part of the current government, the Ministry of Fisheries and the Minister of Justice, that basically took bribes to give special fishing quotas to Icelandic companies from Iceland, a specific Icelandic company. So just as a precursor to the context is Iceland was roped in, or the government of Iceland rather, was roped in soon after our independence because they have such a developed fishing industry to come and assist the Namibian government in setting up a fishing industry.
That's nice.
And
think about it, yeah.
once they completed that mandate, a private company then came in and got some fishing rights as well. But the problem was this private company didn't have any factories in Namibia. It didn't process any of the fish in Namibia. It just caught it and it processed it somewhere else and it would sell it off. And it gained a comparative advantage compared to its competition, which is even from locals, that these two ministers then allocated more than usual fishing rights to this specific company for kickbacks. And it was all exposed in a WikiLeaks expose. And you also had a Al Jazeera documentary that came out recently. And ultimately, all of this information led to the arrest and the resignation of these two ministers initially, and then they were arrested. And the case is now in the courts of Namibia to see that they are prosecuted for what they have done.
Yeah, I mean, that's really impressive if you think about members of the cabinet actually being directly involved in that. Something unimaginable to other countries probably, but this also maybe shows which impact fishing as such has, and at the other end also which lacks maybe this a long-term SWAPO dominance has brought to some of the of the members of that party, thinking like they can, as you said, change the constitution like this, and also maybe take care of other things.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Yeah. So
really have an influence in that.
maybe last but not least, a few words. I think we covered well the economic aspect on that. Could you maybe also, for the outside perspective, tell us a bit about foreign country relations, being it political or economic? Who would you say, maybe China or Europe? Who else is involved in Namibia in terms of economy?
Yeah, I think our biggest trading partner at the point in time is South Africa.
Okay.
In terms of imports, Europe is a big market for us to export. Like I said previously, our meat products and our fishing products and so on. China has also opened up as a market recently. Political relations, China would be obviously, I think we're all aware of China's encroachment on Africa at the moment. Namibia has not been spared the rod in that sense. We've grown very close to China over the past few years, taken various loans from them over the past few years. And our relationship with Europe has not been the best over the past few years. We've had some key policy differences. Yeah. I think the Europeans are normally a little bit more, I would say, assertive in terms of how they want to play their relations as compared to the Chinese. That doesn't really divulge much in domestic policy. But the European states specifically had a lot of issues with, LGBTI rights, yes. These type of things, economic rights as well. We had a landmark bill that was going to be sent to Parliament, which required for foreign companies, multinationals, and big foreign companies to at least have a certain percentage owned by Namibians if they want to open up a business. And there was a huge pushback by specifically the European Union and, of course, the entire European diplomatic corps in that sense, which just pushed back relations a bit more.
So some sort of protectionism to in an indirect way. Yeah. Like just to have a quota, like the thing to avoid the thing that happened with the Icelandic company, kind of.
Of course.
Well, that's something I'm sure the Chinese understand much better.
Well, yeah, I think that the point of the Chinese is always that they, they are not as concerned about human rights, which is wrong. I mean, there should always be the protection that people have always gotten from the imperial powers, if you would like to call them that. Which is the West basically, is that they would always have these preconditions to, whatever relationship they have with a country, that human rights ultimately should be fundamentally respected. Not that Namibia has a bad record for that. We do have upheavals here and there in terms of that. And I think China doesn't require the same. It doesn't put as much requirement around it. And it's more interested in an economic relationship more so than having like a human rights-based political relationship.
Yeah, and I guess also in that case, I mean, you guys both share the let's say, more or less Soviet past. So some similar understandings also probably are at place. If I see also Hage Geingob, the current president, being educated in Russia, I'm sure there's some more understanding, mutual understanding.
Yeah. To a certain extent, yes.
Interesting. And then something, of course, I drew attention to. I was surprised. I mean, I knew that Germany is a close, let's say, country to Namibia historically. But what is the case with Finland? I didn't know Finland seems to be up on the map there.
Yeah, I think it's just. I think right after independence, especially with trying to establish education systems and so on, Finland was roped in, just like the Icelanders were roped into. Yeah. We basically looked at which first world countries have developed which things, which sectors very effectively and quickly. And so I think the Finnish, in terms of that, we have lots
same
of
population
economic,
kind of
of
thing,
course,
same
of
size,
course.
similar, very many similarities. I mean, except of course the whole temperature, but
of course. But also because it's a very technical relationship in terms of that, compared to like a more political relationship that we'd have with other European states. The Finnish and so on don't really take that much interest in domestic policy and these type of things, trying to influence that. So yeah, it's a very quiet relationship, but it's a significant relationship.
Interesting. So yeah, last but not least, I think something that everybody will know or has already known about Namibia, and with which I would like to close, is going to be tourism. I mean, what a beautiful country that is to visit, isn't it?
Indeed it is. We have a very bustling tourism industry. I mean, community tourism especially, I think is very important for Namibia because it provides employment and it allows people to, stay in contact with their history. Germany is actually the country with the biggest amount of tourists to welcome every year, for obvious reasons, of course. I think we should just include genocidal education in the tourism packages.
Yeah,
as well
make some posters, some markers on the safari. Absolutely.
Yeah. But Germany is one of our biggest markets for tourism. And we have a beautiful country with
absolutely
very diverse landscapes, diverse forms of climate from different parts of the country. You have the deserts, you have the deltas, you have the rivers, the south, you have the Atlantic Ocean, cities like Swakopmund, like I mentioned before, and all of these different landmarks, and tourism
in national parks,
industry.
A lot of exotic
and
animals.
I also think I think it's one of our most sustainable industries. It's easier to sustain compared to all of these natural resources and so on, and it's more directly involved. It's less, at least for certain parts of it, it's less capital intensive. So you can have people who actually need empowerment from tourism participate in it as well, as compared to setting up a fishing company. It's very hard for someone from a small village or a small town or a city even to just go set up a fishing company because it's capital intensive. But it's easy for them to set up a tour company, to take people around, to work with someone else, to transport them. And, it's a very interconnected industry that can empower the most common of people across the country. And that's why I think it's not reached its full potential yet. It can still do a lot more, but we've also recently opened up our airspace. In the past, we didn't. We gave exclusive rights to certain airlines, such as South African Airlines, British Airways, and Air Namibia, which is our
Eurowings even used to have a direct route. Speaking of German,
yes,
yes.
Yeah, and Lufthansa now started a new flight again, competing with Air Namibia on the Frankfurt route. There was a route to Cologne to Windhoek, but it was closed, I think, because of mere numbers. But Air Namibia has always dominated the Frankfurt-Windhoek route. But recently we opened up. KLM now flies to Namibia. Qatar Airways now flies to Namibia. And a lot of other airlines will be coming soon, by the look of things. Yeah, so once that happens, I think the thing with tourism always is the logistics aspect in terms of getting people to a place is very important because airlines play a big role in terms of promoting the tourism market as well. And Germany is a big market with its population. I mean, the rest of Europe also is, but the reason we always focus on Germany is because of the history and, creating an interest for the market to want to come.
Yeah, that's also, I think, something important now in combination with the discussion we have had earlier on this podcast now about the compensation, that there's no hostility or something. People are very open to talk about it, and you would be surprised. I was surprised how aware they were of how many debates are ongoing. The civil society, young people you meet, they actually are not only very calm and rational in that sense, but also very aware of all the different perspectives that are existing out there. And as a lady, I remember from the German embassy told us, it is somewhat of an Africa light. So even for people a bit more shy or a bit more scared of big adventures, there's going to be a place for you in Namibia, guaranteed.
Of course. No, definitely. Definitely a place for everyone in Namibia.
Beautiful. Well, Shaandre, I thank you very much. You did, despite our mutual history, a very professional job of taking the analytical politics position here. And I hope that some of these debates or the discussions of this show can be beneficial to others. And yeah, I'm looking forward for the continuation of the
Yeah.
Namibia chapter. The last words belong to you, my friend.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Africa, for our months, for having me. I really hope that I serve justice. I could have done better, but I really hope that I serve justice towards the Namibian narrative. And yeah, to anyone listening out there, I just spoke of the tourism market. It's booming. We have a pretty safe country. Namibia was voted one of the safest African countries for many years in a row. Our capital city, Windhoek, retains. We had first spot in terms of Africa's cleanest capital city for more than 4 years, and that spot was unfortunately a few years ago taken by Rwanda, Kigali for that
Coming
matter,
up
but
soon.
we're still number 2
Coming
on
up
the
soon.
continent. Yeah, coming up soon. We still have the freest press on the continent, number
Absolutely.
1 for press freedom in Africa, and we're the top 20 in the world, in fact. This just tells you of how strong our institutions are. Of course, we have our challenges as well. That's mentioned with the fish rod issue, for instance, and various other challenges like the Gini coefficient and so on. But we are an industrious, hardworking people that's always seeking to improve our country, a very young nation. But I think that, like I said, there's a place for everyone. There's something to see for everyone. And yeah, everyone's most welcome to visit Namibia at any point in time. The country will welcome you with its warm hospitality. Frederic is testimony to that. And yeah,
if anyone has any follow-up
with you
questions,
guys.
don't be
And,
shy. You can contact Shaandre, of course. And yeah, perfect. I think you did a good job of representing Namibia here. And I thank you very much for participating.